Let's talk VDML with KJR.
Hi, I'm Kelvin Ross. We're here for another Let's Talk VDML podcast. I'm really excited today. We've got Kate Conroy from the Queensland Government, Chetty, and we'll let Kate explain that, together with our own Mark Pedersen today. We're going to be chatting about insurance. So let's kick straight into it. Kate, tell us a bit about your role and how you got there.
Yeah, sure, Kelvin. Thanks so much for having me both to this great podcast. So the Queensland Government, saw generative AI explode in November 2022, as we all did, and saw the need to, resource effort, line of effort into AI use in the Queensland Government. They were aware the beginning of 2023 that, of course, everyone was exploring it, including government employees. What can ChatGPT do? Is it useful? Is it not useful? Am I allowed to use it if I work in the government? And it was really immediately obvious that there was a policy pressure there to come up with a reasonable way for public servants to engage in this generative AI moment. And so to that effect, the Queensland Government published a guideline in use of generative AI in the Queensland Government. I think it was the first jurisdiction to release one in about August last year, which for government is fast for a whole new technology. And it was a pretty reasonable framework, right? It actually said that if you're a Queensland public servant, you can use publicly available generative AI tools, but you need to take responsibility for using them and you mustn't put government data into them. And it had a whole bunch of other reasonable guardrails around the use of generative AI. It also spoke to the idea that you should use generative AI tools made available to you by your agency. But at that moment, there wasn't any generative AI tools available inside the Queensland Government to be used that might be a bit different from a publicly available tool. Microsoft Copilot 0365 was released in November last year, but it was also released without a transparency statement and potentially without a lot of immediately implementable or pragmatic ways for agencies to go through the kind of risk assessment that such a radical product, exciting product, but a radical product might warrant. And so luckily, Queensland Government funded the Data and Information Services Group, changed the name of it, turned it into the Data and AI Group inside Queensland Government under Nathan Bynes in the Queensland Government Customer and Digital Group area. So sort of the IT crowd who might have been in the basement suddenly became like very cool and groovy and were able to build a prototype of a generative AI product inside the Queensland Government called QChat. And we're very excited. We're a finalist in the Queensland AI Hub Awards that are coming up for this work under Jay Sindorf, our director of the AI unit under Nathan. And the idea there was to say, well, what can we build inside the Queensland Government that concords with the values and obligations in our IT policy and our security framework that allows internal use of a generative AI tool? And so QChat was born. And QChat was born at the same time as they brought me in to say, could you help us out thinking about responsible and safe use of AI and AI assurance? And I'm like, Bonza, yes, would love to help Queensland. Great opportunity. And so I was working alongside a pretty agile tech team, which was my favorite place to work, is across the silo, embedded in a tech team, so that we're always, some would say rudely, eating our own dog food or drinking our own champagne is the motto. So the idea is if we're making risk frameworks and obligations of governance and policy and process, that it's got to be palatable and practical and usable and helpful to our techies and managers and communicators and our admin, that we're not creating an overly burdensome product that doesn't really reflect the way that these technologies operate. We want to make something that is going to help us have those conversations with our stakeholders and ensure that ability to be transparent and accountable, which are the sort of founding principles that we actually have in the Queensland Government under the Public Sector Ethics Act 1994. It actually says we have to be accountable and transparent along with other obligations, and we can carry that forward into the way that we discuss the use of AI in the Queensland Government. So over the last almost year now, I guess, not quite, the AI unit's been building actual tools deploying QChat internally, building safety guardrails, working with the Public Sector Commission, finding out how to get values alignment, building it to be a more Australian-centric experience, understanding the strong bias from the US, the strong bias from the sort of global data market that GPT has been trained on, and then helping Queensland government employees on board with that responsible AI skill set. So doing training courses, sort of doing AI education and uplift, working with senior executives to help progress Queensland signing on to the National AI Assurance Framework for Government, which is a super exciting product that all jurisdictions in Australia have agreed to. Like, it felt like working on a new constitution. I've got to tell you, like, maybe that's overblowing it, but like, you know, 1900, all of the states in Australia had to agree on how to be governed centrally. And the National Framework for the Assurance of AI in Government has every jurisdictional stamp on it to say this is the right approach. It's not too heavy-handed, but it gives the broad sense of obligation that everyone knows is the right way to go to use AI in government.
It's an interesting move. As a born and bred Queenslander, and so is Mark. Yeah, we're so parochial up here, right? Like, for us to actually get on board with the rest of the country, I think that's
No, we're leaders. We're leaders. I mean, I was born in Sydney, grew up in Melbourne, moved to Queensland, been here for almost 20 years, so almost a Queenslander, but I have lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else. And when we had this interjurisdictional conversation, Queensland was leading all jurisdictions in both technical build and bringing in AI ethics expertise, which was just around, honestly, hiring decisions by my leadership, like Nathan Bynes and Chris McLaren, and Jay Sindorf, the team that were like, this is what we need to do to bring Queensland government to the moment, and to have leadership that actually understands the importance of all of these different roles. And Chris McLaren's such a huge advocate for diversity and inclusion. He really wants to reach out to the vulnerable and marginalised in our society and to get that access. And because of those values, we are in an extremely unique situation in government that we've been able to fund and progress some of this work. Some of the other jurisdictions, look, it's hard in government. You build up capability in silos, and it's really hard to suddenly create new positions for a specific purpose. And so a lot of people come in through a traditional IT background or data governance background. There are jobs in those places, and they need to be utilised in order to furnish AI governance and to make sure that we are able to supply AI appropriately. But AI represents risks that go beyond data, beyond IT, beyond security. And it's those untreated socio-technical risks that this national framework had to contend with. And we're going to see, hopefully, more investment in enabling a lot of different parts of government to contribute to that AI risk management profile.
And look, you know, we sit out, we're from the private sector, but probably 60-70% of our work's with governments around Australia. We're a Queensland founded company. And I think it's important because even though this is government AI policy, it will leach over to the private sector. Because again, companies like us or whoever's building systems just know, okay, well, we just need these methodologies and processes in place for how we do everything. Because ultimately, if we want to deliver into government, we need to be compliant with that as well. So even though, you know, and I like that government focused on what they could influence around government policy rather than trying to make it a whole of Queensland policy and what they do, but government will sort of lead people in a direction just simply through that procurement part. And from a national point of view, we don't want to, you know, we can't afford to have bespoke things that we've got to do in different, you know, jurisdictions and things like that. So, you know, that's really important, I think. From perspective.
Yeah, and that was recognised with the effort on the national framework, which I actually think it's lived up to, which is to be that similar conversation for SMEs across the jurisdictions, also with the way we discuss with the bigger AI players in the field. Because the bigger AI players have a bit of a control over Australian government behaviours, right? And so if all the jurisdictions have similar standards and that they expect a certain amount of transparency, those bigger providers are also going to find that they run into headwinds in a way that they might have tried to, like, do things in little disaggregated cells and with each jurisdiction, now there's going to be a lot more alignment to make it harder for them to weasel out of particular kinds of risk treatments or mitigations or disclosures, and I think we need to have more expectation of disclosure with SMEs and the big players. One of the big conversations in government across all jurisdictions is how to manage procurement. And some of the factors that have come up that are quite diverse include challenges with existing contracts with vendors, where vendors now introduce an AI component to their existing product. And I'm just going to throw out the example of Miro. So Miro is a sort of ideation tool online, and they've all of a sudden got this AI bit to it, right? And all the government's done is procure a license, a subscription to like a professional Miro account with a certain number of licenses, and it hasn't gone through any AI risk assessment. Now, it's an interesting question. How much risk assessment do you have to do? Well, if you don't have a tool to work through that question mark, then you aren't able to answer the question about how long that piece of string should be. So there's that interesting question. There's obviously how do we contend with existing vendors who we've traditionally bought IT with, where, to be honest, there's been a lot of trust with updates and changes. And then all of a sudden with the AI offerings, it represents a radical shift in how data is utilized within the tenant, the way that data is manipulated, all of these opaque and obscure ways that vectors are interacting with statistical likelihoods to yield results. And there is not a culture necessarily in government to contend with risk assessment of such a complex AI-enabled system. There's a desire to use this stuff, but there's also a lack of resourcing to do, for example, the data mitigations, all of the data hygiene stuff that is made manifest. Like for years, people have been saying you should do good data management, keep your data clean, file management, metadata, classification. It's been, old-fashioned data people have been going on and on about this for 30 years. But with the increase of cloud service provision and the increase of limits of the amount of megabytes of crap you can store, people have just been filing this stuff into folders and not worrying about it because they can. And all of that is being like shookled up with generative AI because it gets in there and it starts mucking around with it and starts putting out all of this verbal, I call it word salad, right? The word salad coming out from all of this stuff. And you find people's commercially protected IP could be scooped out. And all of a sudden, it looks like the Queensland government's come up with a new good idea. And it's like, well, hang on a second. That came from a pitch that this company over there put to this guy back in 2016 that nobody ever actioned. And all of a sudden it's living again, and I just think there's a whole bunch of litigation ahead of us from what happens with the word salad. Procurement is very interesting. And then, of course, there's just new procurement around developing new AI products. And how well does the Queensland government know how to ask questions of those vendors? So, for example, the State Library of Queensland released a chatbot on Anzac Day. And the chatbot was intended to better utilise all these wonderful resources that the State Library has in World War I. But they made a whole bunch of choices that it's unclear whether they did the right consultation. And so the avatar they created was not a real human. It was an AI morph of a digger. And of course, people immediately started jailbreaking it and trying to get it to like answer SQL questions and get outside of its box of World War I. And then did it have an uncanny valley effect where people didn't really feel like they were understanding an individual? Instead, they were having this morphed experience between like a data retrieval thing versus a human being. And they didn't quite necessarily know how to communicate the difference between having a narrative dialogic experience with an old digger was based just or fed over just that digger's experience versus not a digger at all, really actually the State Library wanting to better access and represent the experiences of our diggers are going over a number of different individuals over these huge data sets. And all of these questions may have been able to be answered if we had good mechanisms and frameworks to think through the risks that could have got to actions to build the just even the communication about the product to the public. It may not be that the product needed to change too much, but it's a great example of sometimes the vendor you choose who says, oh yeah, we can make you a chatbot. Of course they can make you a chatbot, but they're going to need you, the Queensland government, to hold their hand to go through all of the things you might need to think about before you make a public-facing chatbot using
You might have outsourced
data.
the technology, but you haven't outsourced the risk, right? It's
Exactly. And then that exact example came up in some of the workshops that we've run for execs in Queensland, both government and private sector, drilling into all of those sorts of things, understanding how's the technology working, and therefore what are the inherent risks, and then what's the responsibility that you've got to provide that sort of guidance, both to an AI vendor, but also to your own staff. So your point about what kind of data gets surfaced, we've seen people's eyes widen where you've gone, oh, well, let's say we have an internal retrieval augmented generation system that we're just going to use internally on our own documents. But if we don't manage exactly what documents that system's got access to, people can say, oh, who got a promotion recently? And it'll happily summarize exactly who and when and what their salary bump was or whatever, or other things, disciplinary letters, or just, here's a folder that looks like it's got a whole bunch of employee contact details, including blah, blah, blah. And I've just seen, beautiful, very coherent summarization of information that I shouldn't be seeing. I mean, thankfully, this was just a test example, so there was no actual privacy breach going on. But it's the point being that it's all too easy to have something that's working as intended, but then you give it access to the wrong information, and then suddenly you've got an issue. So yeah, doing all of that stakeholder management and transparency and education internally and externally, I think it's exciting, but it's challenging.
Well, I think that's the interesting thing as well, Kate. Like, who's the audience for these kinds of frameworks? Because I think, like you said, I'm a techo, I've been working in this space and we're doing all this stuff, but actually the users of these policies are not necessarily the tech team, right? I don't think it should be the tech team that's actually writing this sort of business risk governance, but it's that element of raising literacy and, here's the way forward, a framework they can work with that's practicable.
Yeah.
But yeah, who is that audience for that you're finding with these?
It's such a good question. The OECD classification of AI systems framework was some of the underlying framework we use to think about risk in the Queensland government. And you're absolutely right that the techos can't handle a lot of the socio-technical risks that emerge through the development of these AI systems. And so then you say, well, how do we actually have a framework, and who's filling it out and who's using it? So the first thing is who's filling it out, and what's the mechanism that you need? What's the best practice in filling out an AI risk framework? And we say it has to be a multi-domain expertise group, at the very least a techo, a policy person, and a domain expert. The domain expert understands the context in the domain. The policy governance person has the sense of the obligations. And the techo is more responsible for the traditional IT considerations, particularly around security and functionality and risk from those elements. That's your minimum group to think it through. And then what we've found is that you just, with every AI implementation, some of the risks that you're going to uncover mean you need to reach out to different parts of the government. So one of the early things we found in Queensland government was we released this responsible use of generative AI guideline. But what we were missing was the relationship between generative AI inputs and outputs and our obligations under the Public Records Act. Because what we felt was a foundational obligation was that regardless of ethical judgments about the use of AI, whether it should be used or shouldn't be used, if it is used, and it is used to affect administrative decision-making by government employees, and the use of generative AI counted as a decision, then you needed to keep track to make an auditable trail of data and information and how that decision was come to. So that set of obligations, we were really worked with the archives, and we were able to release a QJR policy on artificial intelligence public records. And it just spells out the connective tissue there between use of AI and obligations to keep records. That's just one example of an area of risk that is outside of traditional IT, although there is often a correspondence. People do talk about records obligations in data and IT systems, information management systems. That is an old-fashioned discussion. But we needed to get some backing from those who are experts in the Public Records Act to make sure that whatever we were doing in AI was going to concord with their expectations. And we've had to do that across so many different risk domains. Workplace health and safety, using AI in government, that's going to affect employees. And there is, in the enterprise bargaining agreement, there's a special clause, a call out to say that, if you bring in new technologies like artificial intelligence into the workplace, then it affects employee employment. Then that needs to be a discussion. So, okay, well, let's have that discussion and let's look at the risks of AI in the workplace. Safe Work New South Wales did an amazing scorecard, an AI risk scorecard back a couple of years ago now, like 2021. And that scorecard's still available, and it goes through all of the risks of using AI in government. And it's brilliant because it draws on the traditional safety frameworks and the way that you would consider physical risks and hazards and psychological hazards. So it really covers off on the bigger old-fashioned safety frameworks and then narrows down the risks for AI, particularly in that cognitive, social, and emotional kind of experience of using AI. And it really gets to some of the fear that people have beyond loss of jobs, which is definitely a thing. Loss of jobs is huge. It's a huge, huge thing. I'm not even touching the loss of jobs, but just workplace well-being and the use of AI and how it can make us, the sort of cognitive atrophy concerns, less connection to our work. Like if you're receiving AI-generated content from your boss, is that putting a bigger wedge between you and the boss? Are we losing our human connective tissue that motivates us and makes us turn up to work? Just as we've had, now we're all distributed around, we're using Zoom all the time. We've already lost that water cooler moment physicality, and then putting the generative AI in the layer there. We just want to be mindful of it. Doesn't mean we have to stop it, but we've got to have that risk as part of our risk profile.
Yeah. So, remind us, when this is coming into effect, when people need to be compliant, and what do you think are going to be some of the gaps that the audience or the people who are obligated to this national AI assurance policy, what's the uplift do you think they need to do quickly in order to be ready for this?
Oof, so much. Okay, so first of all, the National Framework for the Assurance of AI in Government is already in effect. All jurisdictions in Australia have signed on to it. All territories, states and Commonwealth have signed on to the national framework. So already governments have an obligation to have a response to the public to say, this is what we're doing or this is what we're working on. Everyone's very cognizant that there's a lot of lift that has to happen, and that lift is likely to be similar to the cybersecurity lift where we saw the release of ISO 27000 standard a couple of years back. And the Queensland government signed on to that standard and then had roughly a 5-year journey where they developed a cybersecurity unit, and they were able to resource it and help all agencies uplift to be more secure in their environments. We sort of see in Queensland that the same sort of lift is going to happen in AI. And at the moment, we've got exploratory funding for QChat and AI safety and assurance. And obviously, there's a new government coming in Queensland. It'll be an interesting question, their priorities. But one of the directions that could occur is more investment in AI capability uplift that is about enabling Queensland agencies to use AI more effectively, safely and responsibly, and that would be resourced appropriately to provide those sort of assistance in various forms. So the national framework's already in effect. There's a bit of patience in delivery, but the most exciting thing probably to come out that's a mandate, because who doesn't love a mandate? So there is that mandated national framework, but the Commonwealth Government through the Digital Transformation Agency just released their responsible use policy for AI for all Commonwealth Government agencies, coming into effect 1st of September. So you heard it here now, Tuesday, second working day after the effect of this policy. And the main obligations of that for all Commonwealth agencies is you have to appoint an accountable officer for AI, and you have to release a transparency statement to the public 26th of February 2025. They've got 6 months. They've got the summer when they should all be holidaying. Instead, they're going to be working on the transparency declaration, every agency of the Commonwealth Government. And that includes tests of measuring and monitoring the system performance of AI for the public to understand how the agencies are actually managing risk and their risk controls. So that transparency statement only got released on Friday last week. So that is
not long, right?
Not a long amount of time.
I would imagine there's a few nervous people going, I'm now what?
I'm now what? I'm the accountable officer. So I'm hoping that there's an opportunity for those who've been in the, the data safety, the AI safety and assurance and responsible AI sort of ecosystem. A lot of them exist in academia or in SMEs and all kinds of little pockets around. Hopefully the Commonwealth government, some of the agencies will realise that there's an opportunity to quickly accelerate their ability to provide a good transparency statement by reaching out into the ecosystem. There's a lot of knowledge out here, and there's plenty of experts to bring around the table to help government.
So definitely that's the education we've been doing, Mark, with some of the groups and people in those sort of exec roles in government as well as private sector. Yeah, what do you think? We've been informing them about these governance changes, and a lot of the questions are about, okay, if I'm signing off on this and I've got my tech team doing that, and what do I really need to know about? What's the common thing that their concerns about, this moving space, Mark?
Oh, look, I think the sorts of things often are understanding, well, what's the evidence on which I can actually make a recommendation or on which I can be confident that I'm not just going, oh, yeah, it's fine. How can you demonstrate? And I know that at that senior executive level where people have a responsibility, they want to know what's actually been done. They're not necessarily wanting to know the technical detail of how that's executed. And I think people understand that, hey, there's other folks that have the specific expertise, but understanding the process. So I think what you're pointing out there, Kate, around the measure and monitoring is really important. And it all comes back to the context and that risk assessment of saying, if we're using AI to enable a government decision-making process, let's have a clear understanding of what those decisions are, what's the impact, how well were we making those decisions beforehand? So what's the baseline human level performance? What does the use of AI add? So who's benefiting? Is there a community benefit that we can articulate? And then what's the measurement that we are putting in place to make sure that that benefit is being delivered now and continues to be delivered going forward? And if there are risks, what are the mitigation processes are put in place? What are the, if you like, rights of appeal or something like that? If someone disagrees with a decision that might come out that might be AI, enabled, what are your routes back to those decision makers? So I think those are the sorts of questions that I see coming up from executives, and I think that's a healthy set of questions to be asking.
It is a healthy set of questions to be asking, and I think that clause from the transparency obligation by the DTA, which is, you need to have measures to monitor the effectiveness of deployed AI systems, such as governance or processes. That's sufficiently vague that allows agencies to find some decisions there. But combine that obligation with the National Framework for the Assurance of AI in Government that goes through each of Australia's AI ethics principles that were determined back in November 2019 after a consultation by Data 61 CSIRO. Those principles have actually stuck around. They've managed to be around now for, 5 years. And what's good about the principles is there's quite a lot that has now been provided by them being there that sort of feeds them, that gives them an ability to be utilised. And the national framework goes through risk controls and mitigations for each of those principles, including contestability. And contestability is a really good principle that doesn't necessarily, is not necessarily a national principle for all countries. And Australia's got it in there. I think it's a very Australian principle, to be honest. And I think, the Human Rights Commissioner, when he was there, he's now at UTS, he made sure that contestability was a key part of the human rights considerations around the use of AI. Is it Ed? Anyway, Ed Santo. There you go. Sorry, Ed. I know your name. So Ed Santo was really amazing with his release of Human Rights and Technology report a couple of years ago. So yeah, contestability, key, I think, Mark, and the fact that the national framework considers it, and accountability, reliability, safety, transparency, explainability. These are all things, all tenets against which you could try to come up with measures. It's a bit hard to go from those theoretical constructs to what's on the ground here. But as you say, the senior leaders need to know that the right things have been done. It's the rest of the crew that need to figure out exactly how to achieve what and what's sufficient. And in the place where measures are really hard, then some level of monitoring that is implementable and not too much invasion of privacy either. So one of the things we find in the Queensland government is some people ask us, well, are you monitoring all of the use of generative AI through QChat? And we say, no, not at all. That would be a gross investigation in the way people use data in government. That wouldn't be appropriate at all. So we have very careful levels of access to the way staff are using a generative AI product. And the sorts of things that will invite us in is we've got the sort of normal thumbs up for an output. But if you have a thumbs down for an output, you can't have a thumbs down without a qualitative explanation about why the output wasn't appropriate for you. And that's informative to us to help us improve the product and improve responsible AI training, because sometimes people don't like the output and it's something that they were expecting that isn't reasonable to expect from a generative AI product. They overly trust it. They overly think it's going to deliver facts. Sometimes that's where they're disappointed, and we need to know that that's important for us to put into our training to let them know what not to expect. And sometimes it's because QChat's done something that is problematic and we might need to build a safety guardrail in. And so we do look at data a little bit, but it's really justified against a bigger question mark of privacy as well.
Yeah, balancing all of those different controls and making sure that you've got the right guardrails in place, but the right levels of education and concepts around shared responsibility of understanding this is what this tool can do, and this is what I can expect of it, and this is what I'm responsible for as an end user, as well as, you know, a senior responsible officer or anything in between. I think getting those pieces right is really essential. And the implementation, I think, is one of the things. So it was one of the reasons why we're kind of doing a couple of pieces. Some of it is that high-level education around policy and governance, and, you know, other things are around, well, practically speaking, if you're running a large language model, how would you test it? And it's not about testing the model, like the bare model itself. How do you test it in context so that if people start feeding in documents that contain, you know, personally identifiable information, how do you make sure that that stuff's not, you know, surfacing inappropriately elsewhere or those sorts of things? So how do you test for that and monitor those things in a practical way? And that's just one example. There'd be lots of other examples. So there's multiple layers at which we've got to get this right as a society, really.
Yeah, on that point, you know, I feel the documents, you know, it's that principles-based thing that we've seen, that extension of the, you know, AI ethics principles now into policy, and it's saying the what, and we've got the when. The trick now is how, right? How we're going to do it. And that guidance to people about what does the management system look like? Who's the lead? What are these roles? You know, what are the evaluation techniques? So there's a lot of work to be done on that side, right? So
metrics are massively important. Metrics, benchmarks, thresholds. You know, what are our performance thresholds? What's a test set that's sufficient in order to demonstrate compliance with that threshold? All undetermined. And will vary depending on the specific AI solution you're putting into place, with all the risk controls around it in terms of what's allowed and what isn't allowed. So no point having a test set that represents use of the product that's not allowed by the policy. So you need, if you've got a generative AI product, it's going to be a test that's going to test on the use of the product that's appropriate in
And I
that
think
area.
for
That's
a
a
lot
lot.
of IT assurance, this is going to be a bit of a shock to them. They haven't, because yeah, we've dealt with like cybersecurity, so 27001 and data privacy, and the tech teams are managing that. But unless you've come from that safety background, or where you've actually had to sort of evaluate that holistic view and how assurance is built, I think it's going to be a challenge for a bunch of organizations where they've just had an IT team just dealing with some of the tech compliance stuff, and now they've got to align it with, policy, legislation, and like you pointed out, there's many areas of that policy that touches on, whether it's human rights, workplace relations, things like that.
Exactly. How do you quantify in the language produced by a generative AI agent that it is the sufficiently inclusive, right?
Yeah.
How do you have a safety guardrail that allows that inclusion, but
Yeah.
doesn't prevent autonomy and agency and language use by government agencies that's appropriate to their area? Good example, if you're in policing and you're trying to get authentic records of dialogue, it could be that in the dialogue, the data has some words that might be offensive. But you don't want to scrub that because that's part of the record. So acceptable language is going to shift, and you don't want a monoculture. You don't want it to be the case that all of our dialogue comes out the same way. So we are in a true values, conflict in some cases. And we know about privacy versus access. That's one. Security versus access, as you said, like the attack vector is so big now. If you allow generative AI to scroll around in your documents, that just changes risk on that side. So even in traditional security areas, there's a whole range of new security risks that weren't necessarily well managed in previous kinds of frameworks, because those socio-technical risks are so much more magnified now. And you can't just safety it away by doing penetration testing. Like that's really important. That's not going to save you from people who get access and what they do inside. There's a whole bunch of things that happen now that's different.
Yeah. So I think, we're going to have to move pretty quickly, because I'm aware of a project we're working on in the health space with the hospital group, and they've already put in place a freeze on any project that involves AI.
Wow.
And where do you draw the line, right? Like if we're using a co-pilot or something like that. So I think very quickly now with this legislation, probably the first step is for organisations to really understand that classification of systems and where they sit and where they've got to drop into a more detailed framework.
It's not legislation. Or is it I don't think it's
probably not
an
legislation,
obligation.
But if it's become policy, then
it has become mandated policy. Yeah.
I think it's that appointment of the accountable officer, that's going to drive it. Like, and if I had to wear that hat, how am I supported in the organization to rapidly not put the brakes on any technology development, because like AI is becoming so embedded in everything in technology now, right? So understanding where the AI is the first tricky bit we've got to understand, so we can actually sort of put things in boxes and go, okay, a bit like the EU AI standard, low risk, don't worry about that. Medium risk, unacceptable risk, and how we rapidly get that high level view on what projects can move forward and not.
But what's funny for me, and everyone's drawing on the EU AI Act low and high risk divisions, and that's what the interim report from DICE suggested Australia should do the same and have a low high risk demarcation. My experience working in government with generative AI, my experience is you can get emergent high risk from using AI in government, depending on its context of use. And so that is my big concern, I would say, about the obligation now for all Commonwealth agencies to report their high-risk AI use cases to the DTA, not for DTA to stop them from using them, but for DTA to try and come up with products or resources to help with high-risk use cases of AI. But we know that in government, almost everyone tries to reduce their risk. They try to not have anything that's triggered high risk. We don't want that.
We don't
Moderate and low risk. And so they're all going to try and shuffle themselves down the risk tables, and they're going to try and provide that justification to keep them there. So that they can go ahead and not have to report to the DTA. But there is emergent high risk, and I think we're going to see that in incidents moving ahead in the future. And I mentioned earlier in the podcast things like leaking of commercial and confidence IP, I think is a really good case where
Yep.
it's the kind of thing that could emerge from what would be considered a low risk AI product, because all we're doing is productivity. All we're doing is like summarizing documents or analyzing our files. Nothing risky about that. So, so it'll be interesting to see how all this pans out. It's going to be a very interesting 6 months.
Yeah, no, it sounds busy, but I think, to keep moving forward. And I'm an AI optimist. I think, this is an amazing technology, but yeah, where is the appropriate place that we use it? So, I welcome regulation. I've spent my life in assurance, but I don't want to just stop because of uncertainty. I think the interesting thing with organizations is how do you continue to move forward in like a sandbox so you can actually build the skills within the organization, as opposed to we don't know, so we just stop and we don't actually build. And it's not like you can bring in KJR or somebody like that to you'll tell me what's required. This is a capability development process in the organization.
It really is. You got to start with the sandbox. You got to start with the sandbox and have a play, because there's absolutely no other way to upskill your people to build the right risk management tools, and bring in the experts.
Even to discover those emergent risks that you're just talking about, you've got to kind of play with it, and then people go, oh no, I didn't want that to happen.
Yeah, that's right. Why is it doing this?
Well, I think literacy is the big challenge we've got.
Literacy is a big challenge.
Skills. Yeah. Cool. Well, look, we've probably chatted way over the time element that we had, and Kate, we've definitely got to get you back for a chat. And this is, I think, like I've spent my whole career working in assurance, and this is the golden age of being in audit and assurance, right? Whoever thought that would happen? But,
audits are hot right now. My favorite new thing, I know we've got to close down, but my favorite new thing is I'm calling it a decision audit.
Yeah.
So everyone talks about data audits.
Yeah.
They talk about information audits, but the really critical thing for AI, particularly if we're bringing AI into service, is actually what are the decisions that are getting made? What are the processes by which they're made? And now, once we have that, we're able to determine the right intersection of human and AI interaction. So I think auditing's super hot. I think you have to be auditing. I think that's what every Commonwealth agency is going to have to do. They have to audit all uses of AI in their whole agency. So auditing's it's the way at the moment. 6 months of auditing madness.
I think it just tells you how pervasive technology has got in society, in business and government, right? That it really influences everything we do now. So it used to be in the back office, keep us techos, in the basement with the pizzas. We're letting us out live now with real people. It's
they're let out into the light, like little mole rats are turning up and getting some
yeah. Anyhow, it is it's very exciting times, and optimistic about what the potential is, but and just doing that with those guardrails is really important, right? So perfect. Okay, well, thanks for that. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Kate. And stay tuned. We'll get you back for another call. So thanks for being our guest this week.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Right. Cheers.